The mysterious broadcast. The twin suns of Zalthus glowed faintly as Zaya climbed to the top of the rocky ridge. The sky was painted in hues of deep violet, and the cool winds brushed against her silver skin. For most of her life, this ridge had been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the cautious eyes of her elders. Tonight, however, her heart raced not from the thrill of freedom, but from fear. Hours earlier, the village elders had summoned everyone to the central dome. There, they played a broadcast captured from deep space, a recording of humans. The images were horrifying. Massive human warships tearing through planets, fire consuming entire cities, and the screams of alien species echoing in the background. The narrator's voice, cold and mechanical, described humans as the galaxy's greatest threat. Conquerors, destroyers, monsters. Zaya had always been curious about the stars, but this broadcast turned her curiosity into dread. Her people, the Zalorians, were a peaceful race. They thrived by avoiding conflict, hiding on their isolated planet far from the bustling star systems. The elders always warned them to stay hidden. But now Zaya understood why. If humans ever found them, there would be no escape. Her claws dug into the rocky surface as she adjusted her telescope, aiming it toward the northern horizon. The skies had been unusually active lately, with strange flashes of light and distant thunder-like sounds. The elders dismissed her concerns, claiming it was just a meteor shower, but Zaya wasn't convinced. She had a feeling something, or someone, was out there. As she adjusted the focus, a faint glimmer caught her eye. At first, it seemed like a star, but it moved erratically, zigzagging through the atmosphere. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a star. It was a ship. She scrambled to her feet, nearly dropping her telescope. The object was getting closer, its outline becoming clearer against the night sky. It was sleek and metallic, unlike anything she had seen before. A shiver ran down her spine. Could it be humans? The thought alone made her stomach churn. Her mind raced with the images from the broadcast. Humans with their cold eyes and ruthless machines. What would they do if they found her village? Would they destroy everything? Enslave her people? The elders' warnings echoed in her mind. We must never draw attention to ourselves. Silence is survival. But Zaya couldn't stay silent. She had to act. She grabbed her communicator and fumbled to connect to the village network. "Elder Kaith, are you there?" "This is Zaya," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was static, then a gruff reply. "Zaya, what are you doing on the ridge at this hour? Return to the village immediately." "There's something in the sky," she said, her eyes glued to the glowing object. "It's not a meteor. It's a ship." Silence. Then, after a long pause, the elder's voice returned, filled with urgency. "Come back now. Do not engage. Do you hear me? Do not engage." Before she could respond, the ship suddenly tilted, its engines sputtering. A fiery trail erupted behind it as it descended rapidly, heading straight for the dense forest on the outskirts of the village. The ground shook as it crashed, a distant explosion sending a plume of smoke into the air. Zaya froze. Her instincts screamed at her to run back to safety, but her curiosity rooted her in place. She had to see it for herself. If it really was a human ship, she needed to know what they wanted. Were they here to invade, or was this just an accident? Ignoring the elder's orders, Zaya slid down the ridge and sprinted toward the forest. Her heart pounded as she navigated the dark terrain, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The smell of burning metal grew stronger with each step. When she reached the crash site, she hid behind a thick tree trunk, peering cautiously into the clearing. The ship was smaller than she expected, barely larger than the village transport pods. It was battered and smoking, with strange symbols etched on its surface. Her gaze shifted to the ground, where a figure emerged from the wreckage. It was humanoid, but its features were obscured by a sleek black suit and helmet. The being staggered forward, clutching its side. Zaya's claws tightened around the tree bark. This had to be a human. but it looked vulnerable, almost fragile. Suddenly, the figure collapsed. Zaya's breath caught. She wanted to run, but something stopped her. Despite everything she had seen in the broadcast, this human didn't seem like a monster. It was hurt, possibly dying. A surge of conflicting emotions flooded her: fear, pity, and a strange sense of responsibility. The ground trembled slightly, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked around, her ears twitching. In the distance, she heard faint mechanical whirring. It wasn't coming from the ship. Something else was out there. Zaya's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her feet refused to move. She glanced back at the human. If she left now, it might not survive. But if she stayed, she could be putting herself, and her entire village, at risk. The choice was hers to make, and she had to make it fast. The encounter. The forest was alive with whispers. The wind carried eerie sounds as it rustled through the towering crimson trees, their spindly branches casting jagged shadows under the twin moons. Zaya crept silently, her silver skin blending with the pale light filtering through the canopy. Her heart thundered in her chest as she followed the faint trail of scorched leaves and broken branches left by the fallen ship. Every step closer made her doubt her decision. She had disobeyed the elders, ignored their warnings about humans, and now she was deep in the forbidden forest, alone. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal, mingled with the earthy musk of damp soil. She clutched her small energy blade, more for comfort than defense. If the creature from the ship was what she feared, the blade would be useless. A faint groan cut through the silence, freezing her mid-step. Her pointed ears twitched, straining to catch the sound again. It came from just ahead, near the glimmer of orange light from the wreckage. Zaya crouched low, her claws brushing against the cool, mossy ground as she moved closer. The ship looked even stranger up close. Its smooth, metallic surface was torn and blackened, steam hissing from several cracks. Symbols she couldn't decipher glowed faintly along its edges. Beside the wreckage lay a figure, slumped against a jagged piece of debris. Zaya's breath caught. The creature was humanoid, but its form was covered in a sleek black suit with patches of silver armor. The helmet's visor reflected the orange glow of the flames, hiding its face. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. One arm cradled its side, where dark liquid, was that blood, seeped through the fabric. This was it, a human. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted. The creature didn't look like the terrifying conqueror from the broadcast. It looked broken, vulnerable. Zaya edged closer, her blade trembling in her hand. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure stirred, turning its head slightly. A faint, raspy voice emerged from the helmet. "Help. Me." Zaya recoiled, her heart pounding wildly. The words weren't a command or a threat. They were a plea. She hesitated, glancing around the clearing. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Something about the silence unsettled her. The humans in the broadcast didn't plead. They commanded, destroyed, took what they wanted. But this one, it was different. "What are you doing here?" she asked, louder this time, her voice shaky but firm. The figure didn't answer. It slumped further, its breathing slowing. Zaya's claws twitched against the hilt of her blade. She should leave. The elders were right. Humans brought nothing but danger. And yet, leaving felt wrong. A sudden mechanical whir shattered the silence, making Zaya's ears perk. Her eyes darted toward the trees. Shadows moved in the distance, accompanied by faint clicking sounds. Her stomach twisted. They're not alone. The human's head lifted weakly. "They're coming," it murmured. "Not safe." Zaya didn't need further explanation. Whatever was approaching wasn't friendly, and if she stayed, she'd be caught in the middle of it. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave the injured creature here to die. "Why am I doing this?" she muttered under her breath, kneeling beside the figure. She shoved her blade into her belt and gripped its arm, trying to pull it up. The human was heavier than she expected, its suit clinking faintly as she strained against its weight. "Move, or I leave you," she hissed, her voice sharper than she intended. The figure groaned and forced itself to stand, leaning heavily on her. Together, they stumbled away from the crash site, heading deeper into the forest. Zaya's sharp eyes scanned the shadows, her ears catching the faint hum of machines closing in. After what felt like an eternity, they found a small cave hidden beneath an outcropping of rocks. Zaya helped the human inside, her arms aching from the effort. The figure collapsed against the wall, its breathing ragged. Zaya crouched by the entrance, peering out into the forest. The mechanical sounds were growing louder. Drones, maybe. She had no way of knowing. Behind her, the human's voice broke the silence. "Thank you," it said, weak but sincere. Zaya turned, narrowing her eyes. "Don't thank me yet. If they find us, we're both dead." The human didn't respond, its head tilting back against the cave wall. Zaya's mind raced with questions. Why had this human come to her planet? What was it running from? And why did it seem so afraid? Before she could ask, a sharp metallic voice echoed through the forest. "Target detected. Scanning perimeter." Zaya's blood ran cold. She gripped her blade tightly, her heart pounding. Whatever was hunting them was close. And it wasn't human, enemy or ally. The cave was silent except for the ragged breathing of the injured human. Zaya crouched near the entrance, her ears twitching at every distant hum or crackle. She dragged the human here hours ago, risking everything to keep them hidden from the strange drones combing the forest. Now, as dawn's pale light filtered through the dense canopy, she began questioning her decision. The human hadn't spoken again since they arrived. They lay slumped against the cave wall, their helmet removed to reveal a pale, angular face streaked with dirt and blood. Zaya studied them from a distance, unsure what to make of their appearance. Their skin looked soft, almost fragile, and their hair, a messy, dark tangle, seemed wildly impractical for a so-called conqueror. Her blade rested within arm's reach, but her unease refused to fade. "Why are you here?" she finally asked, her voice low but firm. "What do you want from us?" The humans stirred slightly, their eyes fluttering open. They were a strange shade of green, vibrant and piercing even in the dim light. "Didn't come here on purpose," they rasped, their voice strained but steady. "Crash. An accident." Zaya frowned, her claws tapping the rocky ground. "An accident? Do you expect me to believe that? You think I don't know what humans are like?" The human's gaze hardened. "And what do you think you know?" She bristled, her tail flicking in irritation. "Everything. You destroy planets. You enslave entire species. You—" "Stop," the human interrupted, their voice sharp despite their weakness. They tried to sit up but winced, clutching their side. "That's not who I am. Not all of us." Zaya blinked, momentarily thrown off by their tone. It wasn't defensive or angry, just tired, as if they'd heard these accusations 100 times before. "Then who are you?" she demanded. "Why are you even here?" The human hesitated, their eyes flicking to the cave entrance, as if checking for unseen threats. "Name's Ethan," they said at last. "Was part of a recon team. Got separated. Ambushed by Xarthans." Zaya's ears twitched at the unfamiliar word. "Xarthans? What's that?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh, though it quickly turned into a cough. "Not something you want to meet. They don't conquer like we're accused of. They wipe everything out. Take what they need. Leave nothing behind." A chill ran down Zaya's spine. She wanted to dismiss his words as lies, but the raw fear in his voice felt too real to ignore. "And you're saying they're here, on my planet?" "They're hunting me," Ethan admitted. "I tried to lead them off course, but it didn't work." Zaya's claws dug into the ground. This wasn't what she had expected. The humans were supposed to be the monsters, not the victims. Why would they be after you? She asked, narrowing her eyes. What could you have that they want? Ethan hesitated, his expression darkening. Something they can't have, he said simply, and something they can't know about your planet either. If they find out there's life here. His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Zaya's heart sank as she realized the danger was far worse than she'd imagined. If this was true, if these Exarthans were even half as dangerous as Ethan described, her people were in serious trouble. But how could she trust him? He was still human after all. Before she could press further, a faint clicking noise echoed from outside the cave. Zaya's body tensed as her sharp eyes darted to the entrance. The sound grew louder, joined by the mechanical hum she'd heard earlier. "They're here," Ethan muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for a small device on his belt. He grimaced when it sparked uselessly. "Stay quiet," Zaya hissed, her claws tightening around her blade. She crept toward the entrance, her movements as silent as the breeze. Peeking out, she spotted a sleek, spider-like drone skittering through the underbrush. Its glowing red eyes scanned the ground, its spindly legs leaving faint impressions in the soil. Zaya's pulse quickened. She had to make a choice: stay hidden and hope the drone moved on, or take it out before it could call for reinforcements. Behind her, Ethan's weak voice broke her concentration. "If they spot you, run. Don't fight it. Just go." She turned to glare at him. "And leave you here to die." His green eyes locked onto hers, filled with a mix of determination and regret. "If it's me, or your people, you know the answer." Zaya's claws twitched, but before she could respond, the drone let out a sharp, piercing beep. Its red eyes locked onto the cave. "Too late," Ethan muttered grimly. The drone's legs extended, and a small weapon unfolded from its side. Zaya cursed under her breath, her blade already in her hand. She wasn't going to run. Not yet. "Stay down," she snapped at Ethan before lunging out of the cave. The drone's weapon fired, a searing bolt of energy sizzling past her head. She rolled to the side, her blade slashing upward in a single fluid motion. Sparks flew as the drone screeched, its legs collapsing beneath it. But the victory was short-lived. From deeper in the forest came the unmistakable sound of more drones approaching. Zaya's heart pounded. "We need to move," she said, rushing back into the cave. Ethan groaned as she helped him to his feet, her small frame struggling under his weight. "Where?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zaya's jaw tightened. "Somewhere they won't follow." And with that, they disappeared into the forest, the distant hum of pursuing machines growing louder with each passing moment. The hidden truth. The dim light of dawn crept through the dense canopy, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the forest floor. Zaya leaned against a massive tree, catching her breath. Ethan slumped beside her, his face pale, every movement strained as he clutched his injured side. The quiet of the moment felt wrong, too fragile, too temporary. Somewhere out there, that Exarthan drones were still searching. "You're not built for running, are you?" Zaya muttered, glancing at Ethan. She tried to keep her tone light, but her mind was racing. She needed answers. Fast. Ethan let out a weak chuckle, though it quickly turned into a cough. "Not in this condition," he replied, his voice hoarse. His green eyes flicked to the faint burn marks on her arm. "You're fast, though. Lucky for me." Zaya scoffed, inspecting the wound. "Lucky isn't the word I'd use." She grabbed a small vial of salve from her belt pouch and applied it with practiced ease. The sharp sting brought clarity to her jumbled thoughts. "Why are they after you? And don't give me that vague nonsense from before. If I'm risking my life, I deserve to know." Ethan's gaze hardened, the flicker of humor fading. He hesitated, as if weighing the cost of telling her the truth. Finally, he sighed. "The Exarthans don't just destroy, they harvest. Knowledge, technology, biology. Anything they can use to make themselves stronger. My team found something they wanted. something they'd kill for. Zaya's tail flicked, her curiosity piqued despite her fear. What kind of something? Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. A weapon, or, more accurately, a blueprint for one. It's encoded in here. He tapped the small device strapped to his wrist. If they get it, they'll wipe out entire systems before anyone can stop them. Zaya's breath hitched. The Xarthens weren't just after a runaway human. They were after something far worse. And now, by helping him, she painted a target on her entire planet. Why not destroy it? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. If it's that dangerous, why not just? Because we can't afford to lose it either, Ethan interrupted. This blueprint isn't just a weapon. It's also the key to fighting back, to stopping them for good. His words hung heavy in the air. Zaya's instincts screamed at her to run, to leave this human and his problems behind. But something about his tone, the desperation, the conviction, made her pause. Before she could respond, a distant hum broke through the quiet. Zaya's ears perked, her sharp eyes scanning the treetops. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The Xarthens were closing in. Ethan groaned, forcing himself to his feet. We can't stay here. If they corner us. They won't. Zaya snapped, cutting him off. Her mind worked quickly, piecing together a plan. There's an old mine nearby. The tunnels are unstable, but it'll slow them down. Can you move? Ethan nodded, though his expression made it clear he didn't have much strength left. Zaya slipped her arm under his, supporting his weight as they began their trek. The forest seemed to press in around them as they walked. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made Zaya's claws twitch. She felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on her. Responsibility for Ethan, for her village, for a secret she hadn't asked to protect. As they reached the entrance to the mine, a yawning chasm carved into the rocky hillside, Ethan stopped abruptly. His face was pale, his breathing labored. Wait, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What? Zaya asked, scanning the forest behind them. We don't have time. I need to tell you something, Ethan interrupted, his green eyes locking onto hers. If I don't make it, you need to get this. He gestured to the device on his wrist. It's encoded to my biosignature, but there's a failsafe. You'll need my DNA to access it. Zaya stared at him, her heart pounding. You're not going to die, she said firmly, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. I've seen what the Xarthens do to people, Ethan said, his tone grim. If they catch me, you have to promise. Promise you'll destroy this before they get it. Zaya opened her mouth to argue, but the hum of approaching drones cut her off. The sound was louder now, echoing through the forest like a swarm of angry insects. She grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward the mine. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls lined with ancient carvings left by her ancestors. Zaya lit a small lantern, its glow casting flickering shadows on the stone. Ethan leaned against the wall, his strength nearly gone. Zaya turned to him, her expression unreadable. You're lucky I'm not the kind of person to abandon someone in need, she said quietly. But if you're lying to me, if this is some trick. I'm not, Ethan said, cutting her off. I swear on my life. Zaya studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good, she said, turning toward the deeper tunnels. Because both our lives depend on it. As the sound of the drones grew louder outside, Zaya tightened her grip on her blade. She didn't trust Ethan completely. Not yet. But she couldn't ignore the weight of his words. The truth, it seemed, was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now it was her burden to bear. Humanity's true nature. The tunnels were endless, winding through the heart of the mountain like the veins of a long-forgotten beast. Zaya moved cautiously, her lantern casting faint shadows on the damp walls. Behind her, Ethan staggered, his breathing labored but steady. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. We should stop, Ethan muttered, leaning against the rough stone for support. You've already done more for me than I deserve. Zaya turned, her sharp gaze locking onto his. If we stop, we die, she said flatly. Her ears twitched, always alert for the distant hum of Tarthan drones. Unless that's what you're aiming for. Ethan managed a weak smile. Not exactly my plan. She sighed, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. You humans, you're supposed to be these unstoppable warriors, aren't you? That's what they tell us, that you crush everything in your path without a second thought. Ethan's smile faded. He slumped down against the wall, his green eyes dull with exhaustion. Is that what they think of us? No wonder you're so ready to leave me behind. Zaya frowned, her tail flicking in irritation. She wasn't ready to admit, even to herself, that she was starting to believe he might not be the monster her people feared. It's what I've been told my whole life, she said quietly. Humans destroy. Humans conquer. That's why my people stay hidden. Ethan let out a low chuckle, though it carried no humor. Not all humans are like that, he said. Most of us, we're just trying to survive, trying to protect what we care about. Zaya raised an eyebrow. And what do you care about, Ethan? Some weapon? Power? He shook his head, his expression softening. Family. Friends. My home. That's what drives us, Zaya. Not destruction. Not conquest. Just the need to keep the people we love safe. For a moment, the cave was silent, save for the faint echo of dripping water. Zaya studied him, searching for any sign of deception. But all she saw was a man who looked tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being misunderstood. You're not what I expected, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither are you, Ethan replied, a hint of a smile returning to his face. You could have left me to die back there. Most would have, but you didn't. Zaya looked away, her claws tapping lightly against the lantern's handle. She didn't have an answer for that. Suddenly, a faint tremor ran through the ground, sending small rocks tumbling from the walls. Zaya's ears perked, and her muscles tensed. They're close, she muttered. Ethan struggled to his feet, wincing as he leaned on the cave wall for support. Then we'd better keep moving. They pressed on, the path growing narrower and steeper. As they climbed, Zaya couldn't shake Ethan's words from her mind. Humans cared about their families, their homes. It wasn't what she'd been taught. The broadcast she'd seen showed only war and destruction, but Ethan's eyes held none of that cruelty. Finally, they emerged into a larger chamber, the ceiling high and dotted with glowing crystals. Ethan let out a low whistle, his eyes widening. Now that's something, he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. Zaya paused, watching him, his admiration for the natural beauty felt. Sincere, she didn't know what she expected. Perhaps some cold, calculated assessment of the crystal's value. But his reaction was almost childlike. What is it? Ethan asked, noticing her stare. Nothing, she said quickly, turning away. Let's keep going. As they moved through the chamber, Ethan began to talk, not about the weapon or the Exarthans, but about Earth. He described vast oceans that stretched beyond the horizon, forests so dense they seemed alive, and cities filled with millions of people, all striving for something better. It's not perfect, he admitted, his voice soft. Far from it, but it's home. Zaya listened silently, her mind painting pictures of a world so different from her own. She tried to imagine a place where people fought for each other, not against. A place where survival wasn't about hiding but about standing together. You really believe that, don't you? She finally asked. That your people are worth saving. Ethan stopped, leaning against a jagged crystal for support. I do, he said firmly. And I think your people are too, even if they don't trust us. Before Zaya could respond, a distant hum reached her ears, growing louder with each passing second. Her heart sank. The Exarthans had found them. They're here, she said, her voice tight. Ethan's jaw clenched, his hand hovering over the device on his wrist. Then we fight. Zaya looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. He was weak, injured, and outnumbered, but he was ready to stand his ground. For her people, and for the truth she was just beginning to understand. Maybe humans weren't monsters after all. Battle of beliefs. The village was chaos. Fires raged in the distance, their acrid smoke curling into the night sky. Zaya sprinted through the narrow streets, her breath coming in short bursts. Behind her, the thundering sound of Carthan machines shook the ground, a relentless drumbeat of doom. Her people were scattered, their once orderly lives shattered by the sudden attack. Ethan ran beside her, limping but refusing to slow down. His jaw was set, and his green eyes scanned the surroundings with an intensity that made Zaya uneasy. "They've breached the outer defenses," he said between labored breaths. "We need to regroup." "We're not soldiers," Zaya snapped, gripping her energy blade tightly. "We're not like you." Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His voice was low but firm. "Then it's time you learn. Because hiding isn't going to save your people this time." The words hit harder than Zaya wanted to admit. Her entire life had been built around the idea of avoidance. Avoiding conflict. Avoiding discovery. Avoiding responsibility. But now, with the Exarthans tearing through her home, avoidance was no longer an option. A piercing scream jolted them both. Zaya turned to see a young Zalorian child cornered by a spider-like drone. The machine's claws glinted menacingly as it closed in. Without thinking, Zaya bolted toward the child. The drone's red eyes locked onto her, and it fired a blast of energy that barely missed. She lunged forward, her blade slicing through its central core. Sparks flew as the machine collapsed in a heap of smoldering metal. The child stared up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Go," Zaya urged, pointing toward the shelter. The child hesitated for a moment before running off, disappearing into the shadows. Ethan approached, his expression unreadable. "Nice work," he said quietly. "You're a natural." Zaya shot him a glare. "This isn't a game, human." "It's not," he agreed. "But it's a fight. And right now, you're in it whether you like it or not." Before she could respond, a series of explosions erupted in the distance. Zaya winced as the ground trembled beneath her feet. The Exarthans were relentless, their machines swarming through the village like a plague. "We need a plan," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do your people have any weapons?" "Nothing that can stop them," Zaya admitted, frustration lacing her words. "We were never meant to fight. The elders said." "To hell with what the elders said," Ethan interrupted, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard it. "You want to survive? Then stop listening to people who've already given up." Zaya's claws flexed, her tail flicking in agitation. He was right, and she hated that he was right. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus. "There's an old power grid near the cliffs," she said. "If we can overload it, the pulse might disable their machines." Ethan nodded. "Good. Let's move." The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges illuminated by the flickering light of distant fires. The power grid was ancient, its rusted panels barely holding together. Zaya's hands trembled as she worked to reroute the energy. Ethan stood guard, his weapon aimed at the darkness. "They'll be here soon," he warned. "How much longer?" "Almost there," Zaya muttered, her voice tight with concentration. The console sparked under her claws, and she cursed under her breath. "This thing is older than I am." Ethan smirked despite the tension. "You'll figure it out." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," she shot back, her focus unwavering. The sound of mechanical whirring drew closer, and Zaya's heart raced. She could see the glow of red eyes in the distance, moving in unison like a predator stalking its prey. "Here they come," Ethan said grimly, raising his weapon. "Got it," Zaya exclaimed as the console hummed to life. She slammed her claw down on the activation switch, and a low vibration rippled through the ground. The first wave of Exarthan drones reached them just as the power grid unleashed its pulse. A blinding wave of energy shot out, knocking the machines to the ground. Sparks flew as their systems overloaded, and one by one, they collapsed in lifeless heaps. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "That'll buy us some time," he said, lowering his weapon. Zaya nodded, her chest heaving as she surveyed the destruction. For the first time, that Exarthan seemed vulnerable. But her relief was short-lived. A deep, guttural roar echoed from the shadows, and a massive Exarthan mech emerged, its towering form bristling with weapons, its crimson eyes locked onto them. And Zaya felt her blood run cold. "Well," Ethan said, his voice laced with dry humor, "you didn't tell me they had those." "I didn't know," Zaya replied, gripping her blade tightly. The mech raised its cannon, and Zaya braced herself. But before it could fire, a group of Zilorians appeared, armed with makeshift weapons and shields. The sight of them, her people finally fighting back, stirred something deep within her. "Together," Zaya said, stepping forward. "We fight together." Ethan grinned, his green eyes alight with determination. "Now you're talking." As the mech charged, Zaya and Ethan led the charge, side by side. The battle for her people had only just begun, but for the first time, she felt something she hadn't in years. Hope, shattered views, united futures. The smoke was starting to clear. The village, battered and broken, stood eerily silent beneath the faint glow of the twin suns. Zaya limped through the wreckage, her blade dripping with dark, oily residue from the fallen Exarthan machines. Around her, survivors emerged cautiously from hiding, their wide eyes filled with a mix of terror and awe. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to fight, to lead, to survive. And she definitely hadn't expected the humans, the very creatures her people had feared for generations, to stand with them. "Ethan," Zaya called, her voice hoarse from the battle. A moment later, he appeared, his armor battered, his face smeared with dirt and blood. Despite everything, there was a faint smile on his lips. "We did it," he said, his tone disbelieving. Zaya let out a shaky breath. "We survived." But as the relief began to settle in, so did the questions. The Exarthans weren't known for retreating, and yet their machines had shut down, their forces scattered. What had stopped them? Ethan seemed to sense her unease. "That wasn't just us," he said, nodding toward the sky. Zaya followed his gaze, her sharp eyes narrowing as she spotted a fleet of sleek ships descending through the atmosphere. They weren't Exarthan. These ships were different, smaller, more precise. And they bore human insignias. "You called them," she said, her voice low with accusation. "I had to," Ethan replied, his tone steady. "The distress signal went out the moment we overloaded the grid. I didn't know if they'd get here in time, but—" he gestured to the descending ships. "Looks like they did." The first ship landed with a soft thud, its landing gear sinking slightly into the scorched soil. A hatch opened, and a group of humans in sleek, black armor emerged. Their leader, a tall woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, strode toward them. "Ethan," she said, her voice clipped but not unkind. "Glad to see you're still breathing." "Barely," Ethan replied, a weak grin tugging at his lips. "Captain, this is Zaya. She saved my life." The captain's gaze shifted to Zaya, and for a moment, Zaya felt the weight of her scrutiny. "You must be one hell of a fighter," the captain said, nodding in approval. Zaya bristled but said nothing. She didn't trust them. Not yet. The captain turned back to Ethan. "We'll secure the area and make sure the Exarthans don't try to regroup. Extraction in 20 minutes. "Understood," Ethan said. As the humans began setting up equipment, Zaya pulled Ethan aside. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice filled with unease. Ethan hesitated, glancing at the busy soldiers. "Your people will be safe. The Xarthens won't risk coming back here, not after this. And if you want, we can help you rebuild. Zaya's eyes narrowed. And what's the cost of that help? Ethan sighed. There is no cost, Zaya. Not everything is a deal or a trick. Sometimes, we just help because it's the right thing to do. Her tail flicked as she considered his words. Trusting humans went against everything she'd ever been taught. But Ethan had proven himself. Will you leave? She asked quietly. I have to, he said, his tone softer now. There's a whole galaxy out there that needs people like me. People like us. Zaya frowned. Us? Ethan smiled. You didn't think I was the only one willing to fight for something bigger than myself, did you? You're a natural, Zaya. If you ever want to see more than this planet, you'd make a damn good ally out there. Her heart twisted at the thought. The idea of leaving her home, her people, it felt impossible. And yet, the battle had changed her. She wasn't the same Zalorian who sat in the shadows, afraid of the stars. As the extraction team prepared to leave, Zaya stood on the edge of the clearing, her thoughts a whirlwind. The villagers watched her with uncertain eyes, their trust fragile but growing. She had fought for them. She had protected them. But now she had a choice to make. Ethan paused at the ramp of the human ship, turning to face her one last time. You coming? He called, his voice carrying over the quiet. Zaya hesitated, her claws flexing at her sides. The stars no longer seemed so distant, nor so terrifying. They were a promise of danger, of adventure, of truth. With a deep breath, she stepped forward. I'm in, she said. The villagers murmured, some with shock, others with pride. Ethan's smile widened as he extended a hand, pulling her onto the ship. As the hatch closed and the engines roared to life, Zaya took one last look at her planet, a mixture of sorrow and determination in her eyes. The galaxy was vast, and she had much to learn. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready.